A young woman is fired without explanation and drops a photo that will change everything. Her boss, tormented by the past, believes he recognizes in it the face of his missing son. But when the truth comes to light, they discover that fate still had an unexpected twist in store. The silence in the meeting room was thick, almost unbearable. Arthur Silvera remained seated at the head of the mahogany table, his hands clasped in front of him as the last person walked out the door. Except for Clara Martins. She was still standing, her gaze fixed on him, as if she had not yet processed what she had just heard. "I'm sorry, Clara," Arthur said, his voice low and measured. "This isn't personal. The company needs to make some tough decisions." Clara took a deep breath, but did not respond. Her pride prevented her from showing weakness, although pain constricted her chest. A few more minutes and that office would no longer be her safe place, her only source of income. Her younger sister depended on her. "I understand," he finally replied, his tone subdued, but he had trouble keeping it firm. "Thank you for the opportunity." Arthur nodded, though he avoided looking her in the eye. Something about her posture, the way she held her bag tightly, made him more uncomfortable than he would admit. Clara turned toward the door and hurried out, leaving behind the echo of her farewell. The room fell silent again. Arthur looked at his watch and sighed, feeling a strange weight on his chest. He had made the right decision, hadn't he? As Clara walked down the hall, the other employees glanced at her, some with pity, others with an uncomfortable sense of relief at not being in her place. In her haste, she didn't notice her small wallet slip out of her purse, lying on the floor just outside the entrance to the building. "Clara!" exclaimed Marcella, Arthur's assistant, when she saw her leave. "You dropped this!" But Clara had already disappeared behind the revolving doors. Arthur, who had just left his office, automatically bent down to pick up the briefcase. It was worn, black leather, and as he picked it up, a photo partially slipped out of one of the compartments. The image made him freeze in place. With trembling fingers, Arthur pulled the photo out completely. It was a somewhat faded image, but the figure in it left no room for doubt. The smiling boy with his tousled brown hair and those big lively eyes was identical to the last photograph Arthur had of Lucas, his missing son. The world seemed to spin slower. Arthur leaned against the wall, feeling the air leave his lungs. The familiar pain, the one that had been buried under mountains of work and calculated decisions for years, resurfaced like a relentless tide. "Mr. Silvera?" Marcella asked, approaching with concern. "Are you okay?" Translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Arthur didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the photo, trying to find a logical explanation for what he saw. Maybe it was a coincidence, an optical illusion caused by his tired mind. But deep down, he felt it. This was no coincidence. "Whose wallet is this?" he finally asked in a hoarse voice. "It's Clara's, sir. She just left." Arthur nodded slowly, as if he needed to process the information step by step. Without another word, he put the photo back into his wallet and headed toward the main gates. The noise of the city immediately enveloped him, but there was no sign of Clara. Standing on the sidewalk, Arthur looked back and forth, as if expecting to see her in the crowd. He clutched his briefcase to his chest and felt a decision slowly forming in his mind. He needed answers. And though he didn't know why, he felt that Clara was the key to something he had been searching for years. All around him, the day was going on as usual. Cars honking, pedestrians busying themselves, voices crossing without hearing each other. But for Arthur, time had stopped. A photo had opened a door he had thought closed forever. "Lucas," she muttered under her breath before re-entering the building. Arthur sat in his office, Clara's briefcase on his desk. The photo, now completely out of its compartment, lay before him like a silent accusation. His eyes never left the boy's face. "Lucas." His mind repeated it over and over again, like a relentless echo. He closed his eyes and, unable to avoid it, the images of that fateful day invaded his mind again. The park was full of children's laughter and screams. Lucas ran towards the swing, his voice echoing happily. "Dad, look how fast I can go." But Arthur, sitting on a nearby bench, barely looked up from his phone. He was checking important emails. "Just a minute." A minute was enough to lose sight of him. His eyes snapped open, breathing heavily. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the burning skin and tense muscles. Why now? Why had that photo appeared at a time like this? A soft knock on the door brought him out of his reverie. "Mr. Silvera." It was Marcella, his assistant, peeking in carefully. "Do you need anything?" Arthur straightened his back, quickly hiding the photo inside his wallet. He wasn't ready to talk about it. "Yes, Marcella," he replied in a firm but somewhat distant voice. "I need you to help me with something. I want you to investigate Clara Martins." Marcella frowned, surprised. "To Clara, sir? Why?" "I just need some basic information," Arthur added, looking away toward the window. "Nothing illegal, just his history, his past. Where he was born, where he grew up. Whatever you can find." Marcella nodded slowly, though doubt still appeared on her face. Arthur trusted her. She had been more than an assistant for years, yet even she seemed to sense that something was wrong. "Of course, sir. I will do so immediately." Arthur watched her leave and rose from his chair, walking towards the window with heavy steps. The gray skyline of the city stretched out before him, filled with buildings that were lost in the mist. It seemed almost ironic that, in the midst of a calculated and orderly life, something so unexpected could shake him again. He clenched his fists. Guilt consumed him. He had spent years buried in work, running away from his own reflection. Professional success had allowed him to silence the voices of conscience, but he had never silenced them completely. Lucas's disappearance remained his open wound, one that now bled again with just one photograph. "What if?" he murmured, but he didn't dare finish the sentence. He couldn't allow the hope that had already destroyed him once to come back to haunt him again. For now, all he had left was to find answers. Although he didn't know what he was hoping to discover, something inside him told him that Clara was a piece in this puzzle that had been left incomplete for years. Without looking back, Arthur took the briefcase and put it away in his locked drawer. Outside, the clouds were beginning to darken the sky, as if the day also sensed the weight of the ghosts that had reawakened. Marcella entered Arthur's office with a folder under her arm, her expression a mixture of doubt and caution. Arthur, who had been looking through documents without real attention, looked up as soon as she closed the door. "Did you find anything?" he asked, almost breathless. "Yes, sir," Marcella replied, placing the folder in front of him. "It wasn't easy, but I was able to find out some details about Clara Martins." Arthur opened the folder with trembling hands. The first thing he saw was an old photograph of the orphanage where Clara had spent the first years of her life. The image of the cold gray building made him shudder. "Clara was abandoned in an orphanage when she was just a baby," Marcella explained. "There are no records of her biological family. She was adopted at the age of 3 by a middle-class couple, but they both died in a car accident a few years ago. Since then, she has been cared for by her younger sister, Beatrice." Arthur sat back in his chair, feeling a pressure in his chest that he couldn't explain. Was it a coincidence, or was the universe trying to tell him something? "What else?" he insisted, his voice barely a whisper. "That's all I could find so far. There's no information about who left her at the orphanage or why. But," Marcella paused, choosing her words carefully, "the dates match the period of Lucas's disappearance." Arthur stood still, staring at the open folder in front of him. The numbers, the dates, the photographs. Everything seemed to fit together, but there were still pieces missing. He couldn't allow himself to hold on to hope only to watch it fall apart again. "Thank you, Marcella," he finally said in a serious voice. "Keep looking. I need more information." Meanwhile, Clara was walking down a busy avenue with a resume in her hand and her mind scattered. She had been looking for work for hours without success. Her legs were already heavy, and her stomach was growling with hunger. But what worried her most was Beatrice, her younger sister. "I'll figure it out," she muttered to herself, as if trying to convince herself. "I always do." At that moment, she felt someone's gaze on her. Turning around, she saw a tall man in a dark coat who quickly blended into the crowd. She frowned, uneasy. Lately, she felt like someone was watching her, but was it just paranoia? Later that night, sitting in the small living room of the apartment she shared with Beatrice, Clara looked at the almost empty plate they were trying to share. "How was work, Clara?" Beatrice asked with the soft voice of someone who still has hope. Clara forced a smile and ruffled her sister's hair. "Fine. Tomorrow will be better?" He lied, hiding the lump forming in his throat. While Beatrice slept, Clara stared at the ceiling. She thought about Arthur, about the strange way he had looked at her the day she was fired. Something about him didn't fit. Why was he so interested in her? Across town, Arthur was also spending a sleepless night. The photograph of Lucas in his hand seemed to look at him reproachfully. Something inside him told him that this young girl, Clara Martins, was the key to understanding what had really happened so many years ago. For the first time in years, Arthur felt that a truth was within his grasp, and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. Arthur watched Marcella as she deposited a news story on her table. The assistant's attentive eyes clearly revealed that there was something important there. "I found more information, sir," she said it with seriousness. "There are details that connect Clara to the period in which Lucas disappeared." Arthur pasted the documents with pressure or accelerated heart. As soon as he does, his hands tremble slightly. The orphanage where Clara was abandoned was just a few kilometers from the park where Lucas would disappear. At the end of the local year, it coincided exactly with the week that Arthur would lose her file. "It's too coincidental," he whispered, trying to convince himself of the opposite. Marcella did not respond, respecting the silence that was installed on the desk. Oh, some distant from the street, 2 cars in the active city seemed empty. Arthur made dough and passed my face, feeling the weight of years of guilt returning like a precise blow. "A Clara?" he asked finally. "Or what is she doing now?" "I managed to verify discreetly," Marcella explained. "You are trying desperately, sir. He has responsibilities like a new one." Arthur nodded, or heard he lost somewhere on Jane. "A decision is formed in your mind. He needs to get closer to her, help her in some way. But I couldn't do it directly, or it would raise eyebrows." "Marcella, transfer an amount to someone who is not associated with me," he ordered. "A value sufficient to help it stabilize temporarily." Marcella franzió a ceño, hesitant. "Arthur, I don't want to interfere, but are you certain? He will not understand where he saw that money." "You say," he replied seriously. "But Clara needs help now, and I need to know more about her. This is what you can do now." As soon as this is done, Clara looks at the anonymous envelope that she had just found on her doorstep, with leftovers, scraps, or paper to discover what was inside. "Sus olhos a regalaram," I'll see a generous amount of money accompanied by a simple bill. "Use this to restart." "Or what is this?" Beatrice asked, approaching, curious. "Nothing," Clara responded quickly, hiding the envelope. It must be some mistake. She tried to ignore the feeling that she was being manipulated. Someone was helping, but why? The answer seemed very uncertain about its future. The next day, Clara was sitting in a cafeteria, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. Arthur approached with firm steps, stopping in front of him. "Clara," he said in a lower, firmer voice, "can we talk?" "Clara or Ankaru?" surprised. "You are here to apologize. It is not necessary." Arthur smiled slightly, trying to calm her resistance. "Not on this. I want to help." "Really?" "Because," Clara interrupted, crossing her arms. His tone was defensive, but there was something more there, a mix of confusion and vulnerability. "Why do you care about me now, after you resigned me?" Arthur hesitated. He could not reveal what he knew or what he suspected still. "Let's say I feel like I owe him something," he finally responded. "May I help her find a new job?" "I thought Niso like, recomeso." Clearly or observed for a long time as one tried to decipher it. Despite everything, he had sincerely not forgotten about Arthur. With a sigh, she nodded, still reluctant. "It's fine," she said cautiously, "but it will be discovered that he did something after that. You will regret it, Arthur." Arthur smiled a slight smile, but it didn't work. He knew she was right. Clara still didn't know, but their lives were more intertwined than she could ever imagine. Arthur parked his car in front of an old building made of worn bricks. The orphanage, now in disuse, seemed frozen in time. The broken windows and the crumbling sign reflected the neglect that marked its history. As he got out of the car, He felt the cold morning wind envelop him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his anxiety. He hadn't set foot in that place for years, but today he couldn't avoid it. He needed answers. The nun who received him was an elderly woman with a wrinkled face and a serene though distrustful look. "No one has asked about this place for a long time, sir," she said in a friendly but distant tone. "Arthur Silvera," he replied, extending his hand. "I am looking for information about a little girl who was left here more than 20 years ago." The nun raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "I regret to inform you that the old records are incomplete," he warned. "Many have been lost or destroyed over time, but please follow me." Arthur followed her down a dark, silent hallway. The echo of his footsteps seemed to amplify in the heavy atmosphere. Entering a room with old, dusty filing cabinets, the nun began to sort through papers while Arthur stood tensely. "Clara Martins," he finally murmured. "She was abandoned here as a baby." The woman stopped when she heard the name. She pulled out a yellowed file and handed it to him. "This is all we have. Clara was found at the entrance of the orphanage one cold morning. She was wearing nothing but a blue blanket and a note that said, 'Take care of her, I couldn't protect her.'" Arthur examined the file with shaking hands. The dates matched. Clara had been left there the same week Lucas disappeared. He closed his eyes, feeling his chest tighten. Was it possible that someone had taken Lucas and dumped him here under another name? The idea seemed absurd, but he couldn't dismiss it. "There was nothing else with her?" Arthur insisted, without looking up from the paper. "No," the nun replied. "Just that. She was adopted shortly after. No one claimed her origins." Meanwhile, Clara, oblivious to Arthur's actions, walked down a shopping street looking for job offers. The feeling of being watched came back to haunt her, a persistent tickle on the back of her neck. "Arthur isn't telling me everything," she thought in frustration. Ever since his unexpected offer of help, something hadn't quite fit with her former boss's behavior. That night in her modest apartment, Clara checked the money in the envelope again. The generous gesture, though necessary, was beginning to feel like a trap. "Why are you doing this, Arthur?" she whispered to herself, looking out the window at the distant lights of the city. Across the way in his quiet house, Arthur sat in his study, holding Lucas's photograph. The guilt was still there, but now there was also a spark of something else, the possibility of redemption. "I will find out the truth," he promised quietly. Clara entered the cafe with cautious steps. Her eyes scanned the room until they stopped at Arthur, sitting at a table in the back, his gaze lost in a cup of coffee. There was something different about him, a tension that seemed to consume him. She took a deep breath before approaching. "Here I am," she said firmly, but with a touch of distrust. Arthur looked up slowly. His tired eyes and dejected expression revealed a weight he could no longer conceal. He motioned her to sit down with a gesture of his hand. Clara, still standing, stared at him. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked bluntly. Arthur took a deep breath, as if he were about to jump into the void. Between his fingers, he held a worn photograph that he had been avoiding showing. He slowly slid it across the table towards Clara. "I need you to see this." Clara frowned, taking the photo with shaking hands. Her gaze froze as she recognized the smiling boy in the picture. "What does this mean?" she whispered, confused. "That boy is Lucas," Arthur said hoarsely. "My son. He disappeared over 20 years ago. This photo, it's the last one I have of him." Clara stared at him, stunned. Her mind tried to process what she was hearing, but each word Arthur said seemed more absurd than the last. "And what does this have to do with me?" Arthur leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "The photo I found in your wallet, it's identical. The face, the smile, everything. I need to understand how you came across it, who you really are." "Are you implying that I'm your daughter?" Clara asked, raising her voice in disbelief. "That's crazy. Please listen to me," Arthur insisted, trying to remain calm. "The dates coincide. You were abandoned in an orphanage the same week Lucas disappeared." "I don't believe in coincidences, Clara." Clara stood up abruptly, causing her chair to squeak against the floor. "Are you listening to me? You can't come here and play with my life just because you have unresolved issues." "I'm not playing, Clara," he replied, looking her straight in the eyes. I just want to know the truth. Clara's anger and confusion mixed inside her like a storm. She wanted to scream, to leave, but something in Arthur's expression, in his broken voice, forced her to stay. What do you want me to do?" he finally asked coldly. "A DNA test," Arthur replied without hesitation. "If I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone." Clara looked at him for a long time, trying to find any sign of deception in his face, but she only saw desperation. "Okay," she said at last, resigned. "I'll take that test. But I want to make one thing clear. You don't owe me anything, and I don't want you to think that you can interfere in my life as if that gives you any rights." "I won't," Arthur replied softly. "I just want answers." Clara grabbed her bag and walked out of the cafe without looking back, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. He closed his eyes and rested his head in his hands. Now all that was left to do was wait. The truth, he thought, might be his only redemption, or his worst punishment. Arthur waited in his office, staring at his phone. The screen remained silent, but every second that passed felt like a blow to his chest. Hours had turned into days since Clara agreed to take the DNA test. Now the wait was unbearable. Finally, the phone vibrated. Arthur took it with trembling hands, reading Marcella's message. "The results are in. It's in the sealed envelope I left on your desk." He turned slowly, as if the envelope might burn him. There it was, sealed, untouched, waiting on the corner of the desk. The whole room seemed to shrink as he approached. Finally, she took it and tore the paper in a determined motion, even though her heart was pounding. His eyes scanned the lines quickly until they stopped on the key phrase, "There is no biological relationship between Mr. Arthur Silvera and Mrs. Clara Martins." The paper trembled in his hands. Arthur sank into his chair, the silence in the room becoming unbearable. He didn't know what to feel. For days, the possibility that Clara was his daughter had sparked a hope in him that he dared not admit. Now that flame was suddenly extinguished, leaving him with an even greater emptiness. "Mr. Silvera?" Marcella's voice brought him out of his trance. Arthur looked up. His assistant was watching him worriedly from the doorway. "It's not her," he said, his voice barely audible. Marcella nodded, not knowing what to say. After all these years, she knew what this search meant to Arthur. Meanwhile, across town, Clara was sitting at the small table in her apartment. She had received the results in an email that morning. "It wasn't true," he murmured with a mixture of relief and sadness. Even though she wouldn't admit it, the idea of having any connection to Arthur had stirred something inside her, something she had kept well hidden for years, the desire to belong, to know where she really came from. "Clara, are you okay?" Beatrice asked, peeking through the door. Clara forced herself to smile. "Yes, everything is fine," he replied softly. It was just a confusion, but the feeling that something had broken inside her was still there, like a persistent echo. Even though they weren't family, she couldn't help but wonder why Arthur had insisted so much. Arthur, meanwhile, remained in his office until the sun began to set. He looked out of the window at the city, feeling like a new scar had been added to his collection. The search for Lucas would continue, but something about Clara had left a deep mark on him. The truth, although painful, had been necessary. Arthur stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking at the modest apartment building where Clara lived. It had taken him days to decide to visit her. The envelope with the results was still tucked away in his desk, now just an empty shadow that I felt. However, something inside him pushed him to continue. When she finally knocked on the door, she heard cautious footsteps on the other side. Clara opened it with a surprised and cautious expression. "Arthur?" she asked, frowning. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he replied calmly. "May I come in?" Clara hesitated for a moment before making room for him. The apartment was small but cozy. In a corner, Beatrice was silently doing her homework. Seeing Arthur, the young woman gave him a curious look before returning her attention to her notebook. "Be brief," Clara said, crossing her arms. "I don't want any more surprises." Arthur nodded, understanding his reluctance. "Clara, I know that the results didn't change anything," he began in a slow voice. "But that doesn't mean I want to disappear from your life." Clara looked at him, distrustful. "Why? Why do you keep insisting on helping me?" Arthur took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because I can't, and because I want to. He paused, meeting her gaze. For years, I believed that success at work would erase my mistakes. But I was wrong. Watching you struggle to take care of your sister reminded me what really matters. Clara looked down. Arthur's words, though unexpected, carried a weight that was hard to ignore. And what do you propose? He asked finally. Arthur took an envelope out of his coat and placed it on the table. I want to offer you a new job opportunity. Not in the same company, but in a position where you can grow and demonstrate your talent. It's not charity, Clara. It's what you deserve. Clara remained silent. The idea of accepting something from Arthur still made her uncomfortable, but there was sincerity in his voice. She glanced at Beatrice, who was still focused on her task, oblivious to the conversation. I don't want to owe you anything, Clara said at last in a firm tone. If I accept, it will be because I earned it with my own effort. And so it will be, Arthur replied with a slight smile. I'm just giving you the starting point. The rest is up to you. Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. Part of her was still suspicious, but the other part, the one that had been struggling alone for years, felt relieved. Thank you, he finally murmured. But don't think that this changes anything between us. Arthur nodded, understanding his words. I don't expect it, he replied honestly. I just want her to have the opportunity she deserves. As Arthur walked out of the apartment, he felt for the first time in a long time that he had made the right decision. He couldn't erase the past, but he could still make a difference in the present. Clara stared at the envelope for several minutes after Arthur left. Life had taught her not to trust anyone, but something inside her, maybe tiredness or hope, pushed her to accept this new opportunity. Who was it, Clara? Beatrice finally asked, breaking the silence. Someone who wants to help us, Clara replied, her voice softer than she expected. Maybe this time it's true. As night fell over the city, Clara felt a small door open in her life. Maybe after all, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Clara adjusted the collar of her blouse, looking at her reflection in the mirror of the apartment's small bathroom. She had been at her new job for a week, and although she still felt doubts, a spark of hope was beginning to grow inside her. She looked into her own eyes and murmured, "You can do this." Around her, life had begun to take shape again. The bills were paid and Beatrice was smiling again, although she still asked from time to time about the man in the dark coat. Clara usually replied with a slight smile, avoiding going into details. On the other hand, Arthur looked at his desk with a strange feeling. Tranquility. He had not seen Clara in person since he helped her, but Marcella kept him informed through small comments. He adapts quickly, she had said with a smile days before. It seems he really needed that opportunity. Arthur sat in his office, pondering those words. For years, he had believed that work could fill the voids Lucas had left in his life. However, as he watched Clara pull herself together, he understood something different. True success was not in accumulating achievements, but in being able to make a difference. That afternoon, when Clara finished her workday, she found Arthur waiting for her by the office door. Surprise was reflected on his face, but there was no longer the hardness of before. "What are you doing here?" he asked, in a tone that tried to sound distant, but without much conviction. Arthur smiled slightly, putting his hands in the pockets of his coat. "I wanted to make sure everything is going well." "It is," Clara replied, crossing her arms. "Thank you for what you did." Arthur shook his head, as if he didn't deserve the thanks. "It wasn't because of guilt, Clara. I did it because I believed in you, because I believe that you still have a lot to achieve." Clara looked down for a moment. For a long time she had walked alone, distrusting everyone around her. But now in front of Arthur, something in her was beginning to change. "Why do you keep doing this?" he finally asked. "You don't owe me anything anymore." Arthur took a deep breath before answering. "Maybe because helping her has helped me," he said honestly. "I spent years trapped in my own ghosts. But watching you struggle, it reminded me of what really matters." Clara watched him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his words. Finally, she gave a faint smile, the first one Arthur had seen from her. "I guess we're both starting over," she said softly. "I suppose so," Arthur replied, a new gleam in his eyes. As Clara said goodbye and walked away, Arthur felt something inside him settle. The guilt was still there, but for the first time there was peace too. Marcella was right. There was still a long way to go, but Arthur was beginning to believe that maybe he could still find Lucas one day. Clara looked down. Arthur's words, though unexpected, carried a weight that was hard to ignore. "And what do you propose?" he asked finally. Arthur took an envelope out of his coat and placed it on the table. "I want to offer you a new job opportunity, not in the same company, but in a position where you can grow and demonstrate your talent. It's not charity, Clara. It's what you deserve." Clara remained silent. The idea of accepting something from Arthur still made her uncomfortable, but there was sincerity in his voice. She glanced at Beatrice, who was still focused on her task, oblivious to the conversation. "I don't want to owe you anything," Clara said at last in a firm tone. "If I accept, it will be because I earned it with my own effort." "And so it will be," Arthur replied with a slight smile. "I'm just giving you the starting point. The rest is up to you." Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. Part of her was still suspicious, but the other part, the one that had been struggling alone for years, felt relieved. "Thank you," he finally murmured. "But don't think that this changes anything between us." Arthur nodded, understanding his words. "I don't expect it," he replied honestly. "I just want her to have the opportunity she deserves." As Arthur walked out of the apartment, he felt for the first time in a long time that he had made the right decision. He couldn't erase the past, but he could still make a difference. The morning air was cool as Arthur closed the gate of the small house where Clara and Beatrice now lived. He had come to say goodbye, though it was not a final farewell. Clara accompanied him to the car, crossing her arms with a mixture of gratitude and firmness. "You don't need to help anymore," she said, although her tone was no longer the same as before. Arthur smiled, leaning against the vehicle door. "I know, but I want you to know that you can count on me if you need me." Clara nodded, her expression calmer. Time had softened her doubts about him. She now understood that it was not guilt that motivated him, but something deeper, a genuine desire to do the right thing. "Thank you, Arthur," he finally replied, "for everything." Arthur stared at her for a moment. There was something about her posture, about her words, that filled him with a strange peace. Clara no longer needed him to save her. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and that was enough for her. "Take care of your sister," he said, getting into the car. "I always will," Clara answered with conviction. As he walked away down the road, Arthur felt lighter. It wasn't a solution, but it had been a new beginning for both of them, a step towards something better. The ringing of the phone broke the silence inside the car. Arthur stared at the screen with a frown. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside him pushed him to answer. "Arthur Silvera?" a deep voice asked on the other end of the line. "Yes, it's me." There was a brief pause, tense. "I'm calling because I think I have information about your son, Lucas." Arthur braked sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. "What did he say?" Her voice barely came out, trembling. "I can't talk on the phone. We'll meet and I'll explain. It's about her disappearance." Arthur swallowed, taking in the words. For years he had been given false hope, empty calls that only made him sink deeper. But this time something told him he had to listen. "Where are we?" he finally asked in a small voice. As he took note of the address, his mind was racing. Clara had been a door to the past, a reminder that he should move on. Maybe after all this time, fate wasn't done with him yet. In the distance, the sun was beginning to light up the horizon, dispelling the last shadows of dawn. Arthur put away his phone and looked ahead, his gaze full of determination. "I'm going to find you, Lucas," he murmured before stepping on the accelerator. Standing in the driveway of her home, Clara watched the car disappear into the distance. She didn't know what was in store for Arthur, but deep inside, a small part of her wished he would find his own peace too. "Come on, Beatrice," he said, entering the house with a smile. "Today will be a good day." The future, although uncertain, no longer seemed so dark to him. The story of Arthur and Clara reminds us that sometimes the answers we seek are not always the ones we expect, but they lead us to discover something much more valuable: the possibility of redeeming ourselves, helping others, and finding peace with our own past. What would you have done if the face of a stranger awakened the ghosts of your history? Would you continue to search for the truth, even if it hurt? Click on the video on the screen and continue this journey of self-discovery, where every decision can change the course of your life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and invite you to reflect.